Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're tackling the Chinese mindset.
Oh, absolutely. Should be interesting.
History, philosophy. We even dug into some pretty fiery internet debates to get a handle on how all of this shapes China's actions in the world today.
Hmm. Honestly, it becomes clear that you can't grasp modern China by just skimming the headlines.
Definitely not.
You really have to go deeper, delve into their history and culture. You find this fascinating mix of ancient philosophies, vivid memories of past injustices, and this really potent sense of national pride.
Yeah, and speaking of history, that phrase Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, it kept popping up in our research. It feels like it's way more than just a name for China, right?
100%. That term alone speaks volumes. It takes us way back, centuries, to a time when China was really geographically isolated. Mountains, deserts, vast seas all surrounding them. It's no surprise they saw themselves as the center of civilization.
So basically everyone else was on the periphery, almost like barbarians at the gate.
Exactly. And what's so interesting is that some sources call it Middle Kingdom syndrome, is still so relevant today. It colors how China sees itself and its place in the world. It's woven into their language, their culture, even how they approach international relations.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack that a bit because there are some huge implications there. If you genuinely believe you're the Middle Kingdom, the most important civilization on Earth, that's got to impact how you interact with other countries, right?
Sure. It can create this dynamic where China sees itself as inherently superior
Right.
and expects a certain level of deference from other nations,
Makes sense.
which, as you can imagine, can cause some friction on the world stage.
For sure.
And you can see this playing out in how China's been extending its influence. Think Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Zimbabwe. There's been a lot of talk about debt trap diplomacy, where they provide loans with strings attached that they can leverage for a strategic gain.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how all of these historical threads are playing out in the modern world.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of influence and leadership, we have to talk about the mandate of heaven. This idea that a ruler's legitimacy isn't just about, holding power, but actually earning the right to rule based on their actions. What happens when things go wrong, when the leadership maybe isn't living up to that mandate?
Exactly, that's the crux of it. The mandate of heaven hinges on the idea that a ruler's legitimacy comes not just from military might, but from moral authority, their ability to provide for and protect the people. If things go south, natural disasters, famine, wars, it's seen as a sign that the mandate has been lost.
And then it's open season on their leadership. Were there actual instances where this came into play in Chinese history?
Oh, absolutely. Historically, the mandate of heaven was used to justify both the rise and fall of dynasties in China.
Wow.
Which makes you think, does the CCP, still hold this mandate in the eyes of the Chinese people today? Especially considering some of the difficult events of the last century.
That is the million-dollar question. And our research really highlighted some truly harrowing events. Massive casualties during the Long March, the devastating famine of the Great Leap Forward, all the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution. These aren't exactly events people easily forget.
It's incredibly complex. On one hand, you have the CCP achieving this remarkable economic growth and lifting millions out of poverty. Some might see that as fulfilling part of the mandate, right? But on the other hand, those events you mentioned cast a long shadow.
They do?
And they raise some serious questions about the CCP's claim to the mandate of heaven. Makes you wonder, if they aren't relying on the mandate for legitimacy, what are they using?
Right. Are those historical events sowing seeds of doubt? Or has the CCP managed to forge a new type of pact with the people? But either way, it feels like those events from the last century, those really difficult periods, they're directly tied to another powerful idea that emerged from our research, that century of humiliation.
Oh, for sure. And to understand the century of humiliation, we need to rewind the clock a bit more.
Yeah, so to really dig into the century of humiliation, we need to rewind to like the mid-1800s. This was when China, which had been a major global power for centuries, really, was basically brought to its knees.
And by foreign powers, right?
Primarily Western powers at that point.
And it seems like this period is, seared into their collective memory. You have the Opium Wars, those forced treaties being carved up by foreign powers.
Yeah.
It's pretty heavy stuff. It must have left a real mark, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's not an exaggeration to say that the century of humiliation is like a driving force in modern China.
Wow.
It fuels this intense desire to regain what was lost. Global power, respect, self-determination. Yeah, it's like this constant echo in their ear. Never again, right?
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, are we seeing reflections of that historical trauma in how China's reacting to, attempts to contain them? Because it feels like they're drawing some parallels, seeing it as a continuation of these past injustices.
That's a really important connection. Just like they saw those forced treaties as deeply unjust,
Right.
they see any attempt to limit their current aspirations, as basically a continuation of that humiliation.
It's like they're saying, look, we took our lumps, learned from it, but we're back and we're not going to be pushed around anymore.
Exactly. It helps explain why they're so assertive, this
Yeah.
determination to control their own destiny, secure their interests, even if it means, I don't know, maybe bending international norms a little, at least as we understand them.
It's fascinating, though, because to really grasp the Chinese mindset, you have to factor in this sense of historical grievance, but also that unshakable belief in their own centrality, that little kingdom idea. It's like this potent cocktail shaping their worldview.
You said it. It's potent, and it really helps explain why China can seem so, I don't know, inscrutable at times,
Yeah.
especially to Western observers. Because honestly, they are often operating from a totally different set of assumptions.
Which, speaking of different assumptions, brings us to that thread you sent over the one where everyone's debating Chinese mentality.
Oh, yeah.
Is it subservience to authority? Pragmatism? People see the same behavior in such different ways, even something as, I don't know, basic as mentality.
Oh, it's wild. And that's where things get really tricky because inside China, you've got this internal narrative that's been shaped by decades of propaganda and censorship. But then outside, you've got this external narrative, which is colored by Cold War anxieties and, let's be real, sometimes just plain old racism and stereotyping.
And the internet just throws gasoline on that whole fire, especially social media creating all these echo chambers where existing biases just get amplified. And it makes it so hard to know what to believe. So how do we even begin to cut through all that noise and really understand how these competing narratives about China are playing out, both inside and outside the country?
Man, we definitely have to acknowledge the massive role of the government in controlling information. They've become incredibly good at using propaganda to shape public opinion, often by emphasizing things like national unity and portraying any criticism as unpatriotic.
And it's not just censoring what they don't want people to see, is it? It's also about actively promoting the stories and narratives that support their version of events.
100%. They are very strategic about controlling the narrative, shaping perceptions from the ground up. But we also have to remember that not every Chinese person thinks alike, right? It's just like any country. There's a real danger in painting with too broad a brush and assuming that everyone's buying into this official narrative.
Oh, for sure. We can't fall into the trap of stereotyping, like assuming that just because someone's Chinese, they automatically agree with everything their government does. It's just not that simple.
Nope, not at all. And honestly, that's where I think those internet debates, even with all the biases and limitations, can be illuminating. They give us a glimpse, even if it's imperfect, into the diversity of opinions that exist within China, even if those opinions aren't always voiced publicly.
It reminds us that there are actual, complex human beings behind these big, sweeping narratives, each with their own unique perspectives and experiences. But for a real-world example of how all these forces we're talking about, the historical baggage, the Middle Kingdom idea, this information control actually collide,
Yeah.
I think we have to look at what's happening in the South China Sea, right?
Yeah, you're preaching to the choir.
Because that's where the rubber meets the road.
Or
maybe, in this case, where the theory meets the reality, right?
And
Yeah.
on a global stage, no less.
Totally.
The South China Sea is like the proving ground. It's where all these threads we've been talking about, the Middle Kingdom idea, the century of humiliation, the CCP's control over information, they all kind of crash together. It's fascinating, but honestly, it's also a little unnerving.
It really is. You've got this situation that feels like, I don't know, a powder keg surrounded by fireworks, right? And then you look at those artificial islands China's building. That's not subtle. It feels like they're flexing their muscles for the whole world to see.
You got it. That's China for you, merging that long-term thinking with assertive action. They'll be patient, they'll wait for the right opportunity, but they are not afraid to push the limits when they see an opening. It's like they're playing for, I don't know, centuries, not just thinking about the short-term gain.
And it's not just about the economic impact either. You've got these major players, the U.S., Japan, Australia, all basically watching China's every move. It feels like the potential for something to go wrong, for things to escalate, that's a real concern.
Oh, absolutely. It's this delicate balancing act, right? The U.S. and its allies want to, I don't know, deter Chinese aggression, but without starting a war. And China wants to assert its dominance, but without triggering a conflict that they might not be ready for. High stakes all around.
So where does this leave us?
Understand that China is playing by a different playbook.
Okay.
Their history, their culture, it's shaped how they see the world. And right now, they see themselves as a global power that's reclaiming its rightful place, and they are playing the long game. Anyone who misunderstands their intentions, underestimates how determined they are, that could be a huge mistake for everyone.